Hello, gorgeous listeners. Welcome to Are You Still Working? How to take your creative ideas seriously. I'm Courtney Collins, and today I'm talking to Winnie Dunn. Winnie Dunn is a writer and general manager of Sweatshop Literacy Movement in Western Sydney. She's the editor of critically acclaimed anthologies, and her first novel, Dirt Poor Islanders, was published this year by Hachette. The novel follows Meadow Reid, a Tongan-Australian girl, as she navigates identity and community within Western Sydney to find a love of her own culture. Winnie Dunn herself is Tongan-Australian and grew up in Mount Druitt. Our conversation took place at Sweatshop on Darug country, which is becoming a hotbed for new Australian writing talent. The day we sat down to talk to Winnie, the workshop rooms were packed out with emerging writers, all committed to finding their unique voice and determined to move their stories from the margins to the centre. Winnie Dunn, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. I've recently finished your wonderful novel, Dirt Poor Islanders. As soon as I finished it, I needed to find a way to speak to you. So I'm so glad we've managed to pull that off.
Thank you.
The title of your novel, Dirt Poor Islanders, where does that come from?
Because it's the first Tongan-Australian novel, I really wanted the word islander to be present because I wanted the book to be recognised as a Pacifica Australian novel, not just by my community but people outside of my community, because we are referred to as Pacific Islanders. And so it was very important for me to have Islanders in the title. But I didn't want something called The Islanders or Islanders because I just feel like it didn't really hone into what the heart of the book really was about. And so I started thinking about different ways to describe Pacific Islanders or Pacificas and what were the stereotypes, how could I subvert it or contradict it. And the phrase dirt poor then came up to me because it's a phrase that I often used to describe myself growing up to my peers, because I did grow up in a very working class family where we were just living on top of each other. And it's a very recognised phrase in Australia because Australia is so obsessed with kind of class and class structures. I just felt like putting dirt poor and islanders together just really summarised the book and the heart of the book. And for me, I just hope when readers open up Dirt Poor Islanders, they see the wealth and the beauty of Meadow Reid's story and the Pacific Islander community through all of that muck and mire.
The muck and the mire really become redeeming force in such a satisfying way.
One of my favourite Tongan words actually is whanua momoko. So whanua refers to land, Tongan land, and momoko refers to being cold. And we use the phrase whanua momoko when we're talking about a person's womb, and the womb being the place where the earth is passed on as a gift. And so if your womb is cold, you can't pass on the gift of land, of dirt, to the next generation. Dirt is really how I also define, and earth is how I also really define being Tongan, and that privilege of being able to pass on Tongan land, I think, or Tonganness through my novel by calling it Dirt Poor Islanders as well, because of that cultural context of the importance of passing on land. And so I feel like hopefully when people pick up Dirt Poor Islanders, it's that picking up of that land that's so important in my culture.
I would love to know, and it is a question that we ask all of our guests, how did you learn to take your creative ideas seriously?
Yeah, I think when I look back on my desire to write, it was something that was very innate. My dad likes to tell this story about how one time he saw me as a toddler staring very intently at the back of this 48-pack toilet paper roll, because I have 7 siblings. And I was just so engrossed in it, and he just found it so shocking that I was staring at this packet of toilet paper. And it slowly dawned on him that I was trying to read the back of the toilet paper packet. And so I just had this natural inclination towards words and trying to understand them. And when I was a teenager, the only things that were really accessible to me were mainstream fantasy novels like Twilight, Harry Potter, Narnia. And so I would write a lot of self-insert fan fiction.
Cool.
Which I love the idea of self-insert fan fiction, because for me it's like that form of autobiographical fiction where I'm just placing myself in this already established world. But obviously I never took it seriously. It was just something that was for fun. But then I was the first person in my family to go to university, and it was only in a university setting that I came across Sweatshop Literacy Movement, which is the organisation that I now work for. And it was founded by award-winning author Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed. And it was the first time I was introduced to writing about Western Sydney by people who lived in Western Sydney, using like very culturally specific words and languages and phrases, slang as well. And because I think I was in a university setting, I was like, this is a piece of literature that we're unpacking together. And it just opened my eyes to the possibility that writing by somebody like me could be taken as seriously as, you know, Sylvia Plath, who I was studying, or Jane Austen, who I read Northanger Abbey at university 3 separate times for 3 different units. And so it was only through Sweatshop that I started to take writing seriously.
Can you tell me where the name Sweatshop came from?
Yeah, so twofolds. Sweatshop historically, as we know, is used as a space to disempower people of colour. Indentured slave labour is what we know as a sweatshop, where just hundreds of people of colour are packed into these tiny rooms being overworked. And so we used Sweatshop and kind of flipped it on its head to be like, Sweatshop Literacy Movement is a space that empowers people of colour rather than disempowers. It also is in reference to the Latin word for text meaning to weave. And so again, it's that idea of stitching in a sweatshop. But instead of us stitching fast fashion garments, we're stitching novels.
Amazing. When did you feel like you had a novel in you, or that burning to write a novel?
Yeah. I feel like it came together very slowly. At my first Sweatshop Literacy Movement workshop, I remember I came with this awful poem about feeling like a lizard because some guy that I met on Tinder had dumped me 2 weeks before the workshop. And then I just remember reading that poem out loud, and then Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed looking at me and just being like, you can't write, start again. And so I had to go back, and it was very confronting, obviously, but I was like, okay, like clearly there's something I don't know about writing. And so instead of getting defensive and shutting down, I think I opened myself up to learning what good literature or good writing could be or look like. And it was from there that I started writing this kind of 3-sentence story structure. So how could I tell a story in the most limited amount of words and be very concise about it? And then I just grew my craft from there. And from about 2016 to 2018, I was writing short stories, just about any kind of interesting thing that I thought happened in my childhood. I also started writing little non-fiction essays about kind of Pacific Islanders in Australia, which was a very rare phenomenon outside of academia. And then in 2018, I got my first grant to compile all my short stories together.
Amazing. When Dr. Muhammad said to you, you can't write, what do you think he meant by that? Clearly you were robust and ready to hear that, because it could have been potentially crushing to somebody else's ears.
I think he literally meant I didn't know how to construct an original sentence. If I'm writing a poem about feeling like a lizard, Courtney, I'm sure you can find about 500 other poems where somebody's talking about feeling like a lizard. But can you find 500 poems talking about the figure of the Doa in Tongan culture, which is a woman who serves gava drinks in a circle of noblemen, and she is the literal and metaphorical representation of a woman named Gava in old Tongan myths who was literally sacrificed for the king in order to feed him. You'd probably only find one poem like that, and it's published in the Lifted Brow. which I wrote, I think, in 2017. And so for me, being able to create an original contribution to knowledge is what makes you a good writer. And that kind of process and being challenged, I think, to try and do that in my writing was really a profound moment for me, and also a very empowering moment as well.
I love that. And you do that so beautifully in the novel. As a reader, I felt dropped into a world like, what is this world? And there's a time shift. Yeah, it was beautifully done.
Yeah, I put the Tongan myth story at the beginning very intentionally for two reasons. The first is it's starting with a birth and it's starting with life. And I think that's what happens when you open a book. You're stepping into somebody else's life or somebody else's shoes for a short time to learn something. Two, and this is generally speaking for the writers who write autobiographical fiction, we get told that it was really easy to write our novels because it was just based on our life and we just fictionalized it a little bit. We didn't necessarily have to do any groundbreaking research, and we didn't necessarily have to think up a whole new world like Narnia, for instance, because, I could have written a book that was just completely about some old Tongan gods and had nothing to do with a mixed-race Tongan girl who grew up in Western Sydney. But for me, that was important because I'm still very much invested in autobiographical fiction. It is a craft. It does take skill to learn. And just because I'm using myself as a primary source doesn't take away from the craft of the writing.
I've had the privilege of being edited by you, Winnie, in the Newcastle short story anthology.
Yes.
And I want to, know your process when you're at the desk revising your own work. If the editor self plays by different rules than the writing self, the self that's put the words on the page in the first place. Do you have a distinction in yourself around that?
For me, the writing and the editing self happens simultaneously. So I'll be writing a sentence in Dirt Poor Islanders and then I'd be like, no, that's a cliche. Oh, no, that's a mixed metaphor. Oh, no, I've put the comma in the wrong place. Go back, and then sometimes it would take me 2-3 hours to write a paragraph because I'd constantly be refining, which I think is why it took me 5 years to complete Dirt Poor Islanders, because I work with my writing self and my editing self at the same time. But also as an editor, because that's how I started off at Sweatshop Literacy Movement. That's how I started off in the arts, was through editing other people's stories, like with Sweatshop Women Volume 1 and 2, that listeners can find on the Sweatshop website. We're a cohort of about 100 diverse writers who come together once a month to listen to each other's stories and provide live feedback to improve our craft together. I really understand that there's only so much of yourself you can edit. And for me as a Tongan, that community process was really natural to me. I often think about how Tongans make something called a natu, which is like a natural fibrous mat, which we tell our stories on through motifs and patterns. The way that the natu is made is that the men grow the mulberry bark trees. And when the mulberry bark trees come into adulthood, the women take over the trees, and then the women strip them, beat down the bark, and then they make individual strips by themselves at home. And they'll agree as a community, okay, each woman in the village is going to make 20 strips. And then they go, okay. And then by Saturday, at the end of the week, all the women come together with their 20 strips and they put it together, and they spend hours putting it together. They spend hours defining how large the mat is going to be or how small it's going to be. And then once all those fibrous layers are put together, they then decide on the pattern, what story they want to tell. And then for weeks and months, they'll paint little sections of the natu together until it's just one big mat that tells one single story, or many little stories that come together on the natu. And so for me, that's how I treat my writing and editing process, is that some parts I do individually, but I could never make the whole thing or the whole novel unless I had other editors and writers coming together to help me tell the best story that I can.
Amazing. In thinking about the structure of your novel, Am I right in thinking that you move forward sentence by exacting sentence?
So consider the strips that I was talking about, those individual strips. They were my individual short stories that I wrote from 2016 to about 2019. And by that time, when I put them together, I had 20,000 words that kind of had a beginning, middle, and an end. It had a mixed race Tongan girl who was struggling with her identity, struggling with her sense of non-traditional family structures because she felt like she had many mums instead of just one. And those mums were not only her stepmom, but her birth mum, her auntie, her grandmother. You know, how do you reconcile that when you're going to school and people say you have one mum, one dad, and pulling together the many pieces of herself. And then from there, I just had to flesh it out. But because I had already done those little strips and put them together, the overall structure of the novel came together quite naturally. And then I just had to paint the pattern. I didn't do any forward planning. And I think I will do the opposite when it comes to my second novel.
What are you working on now? Can you talk about it?
Yes. I'm taking a break because it took me 5 years to write Dirt Poor Islanders. And I gave myself a repetitive hand strain from it, taking a break, just doing the marketing and the publicity around it, which I feel like a lot of writers are surprised by. Just because the book is out there in the world, it doesn't mean that you stop. There's a whole other side where you're having to get it into readers' hands. And so doing that at the moment, which is really exciting. And I'm hoping to hear back soon from a publisher about our grant application to create the first definitive Pacific Australian anthology, kind of in the likes of growing up Aboriginal in Australia and growing up Indian in Australia. Hopefully that comes to fruition because I think that'll be really vital, because I think with the publication of Dirt Poor Islanders and other books like I Am Lupe, which is the first Tongan-Australian children's book, and King, which is a memoir by rapper and musician, producer Haula Careful, there's a kind of real emergence of Tongan-Australian writing and hopefully Pacific Australian writing more broadly. And I hope the anthology will be a real showcase of that and a historical document of that. And then, yeah, I was lucky enough that Hachette signed me on a 2-book deal. And so eventually, I think by the end of this year, I'll start working on my second novel, which is Meadow Reed's journey through university. So we'll see how that goes.
Wow. I'm already looking forward to it. In an ideal setup for you, what proportion would see you working on the novel, editing other people's work, being in the world? Do you have a kind of understanding of how you'd like that to be?
I started off at Sweatshop wanting to be a writer and wanting to write a novel, but then very quickly realizing my passion is in editing. I really love being able to help craft other people's stories, to help emerging writers grow in their writing skills, and to see a story go from okay to great through the editing process. And I feel so lucky to have been able to do that through so many Sweatshop anthologies. But I felt this real sense of duty, I think, to write, because even up until the beginning of this year, the only mainstream representation of Tongan Australians was Chris Lilly, who we all know put on brown face and an afro wig and enacted these really violent, hypersexual, demonizing narratives of Tongan children. I think people often forget he played a high school character. And so in my dream life, I think I would be an editor more than anything else. But I think because I have this real sense of obligation, I think, to my community and I think Australia broadly, to redefine what a Tongan Australian story is outside of that kind of Chris Lilly bubble, is why I'm a writer and why I choose to keep writing. I would love to just be an editor 3 or 4 days a week, which I feel like is what I have at Sweatshop. 2 days a week writing, which is, I think, what I do now anyway. And then 1 or 2 days a week where I can just rest and not think about things and just let my work churn the media and publicity train on its own.
In thinking about your ideal conditions to write in, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's just so funny because I know what my not conditions are.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a house where I have 7 other siblings, one story in Mount Druitt with my 2 parents. And then for some reason, we had 2 dogs at any given time. I lived in a very cramped house and I shared a bed with my sister until I was about 16. She used to tell me off all the time about leaving the light on at night to read books while she was trying to sleep and for hogging the blanket. And so I never had kind of space to grow and think and read in my childhood home because there was just so much chaos, as anybody could imagine. But for some reason I did it. For some reason I did my whole Bachelor of Arts degree in my tiny little single 1-bedroom on my single bed in that cramped household, just staying up until like 4 a.m. in the morning writing my essays. But obviously that's not ideal for me. I feel like that's something I just had to survive through. But I also don't really subscribe to the idea that is classist in a sense, I would say, of kind of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where a woman should have a room of her own and have money to write. And I think she was thinking of a very specific demographic when she was writing that. And it's just not feasible for everyone, especially women who have children, who are from welfare class backgrounds. Those might be the ideal conditions, but they're not accessible to everyone. And I feel like a lot of people in Australia don't like talking about their finances or their situation. And I've gotten in trouble in the past for talking about it. But I like to be really honest about the fact that I'm the oldest child in my family. I was the first person in my family to go to university. And I was also the first out of my siblings to buy myself a small property, just a 1-bedroom unit in southwestern Sydney. And I do have those ideal conditions now that Virginia Woolf was talking about, where I do just have a room of my own to write in. Is it the kitchen bench? Yes, but that's only because I think writing in your bed is a sin against nature. So being upfront about moving from a working class background to a very low middle class background, I think is really important for me to be open and honest as a writer, because I don't want people to think we're just all these starving artists that are just doing things for the sake of art. I just treated writing like my job so intensely that it was able to help me get out of my kind of cramped family situation, because by the time I left my family home, my younger sister had 3 kids. So there was 14 of us at one stage. And so I'm so thankful for my education in university and in writing and my arts career and the arts industry being so open to stories like mine, because they historically weren't in the past, to be able to lift myself out of that kind of cramped family situation and into a space where I do have a room of my own to write. And yeah, my ideal conditions now is kitchen, coffee, my ergonomic mouse, keyboard, music, and coffee, and then my cat interrupting me every now and then.
And sometimes it seems that's how work gets made, in the sense of how a person has found a way to cobble together whatever privileges are accessible to find space and time to create.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I wouldn't have been able to write my book unless I also got grants. I was lucky enough to get my first grant through the copyright agency, and then my second grant, which helped me finalise the novel, through Australia Council. And again, it's also about realising that if you want to come into this industry as a writer, it definitely doesn't pay you full time. That's a very rare occurrence. You might not see your advance paid off for a very long time.
In thinking about the representation of people close to you and in your community, the novel just works perfectly in the way that only a novel can. But as I was reading it, I couldn't help but imagine it as a screen story.
Oh, nice.
And was just like, this is the series I want to see.
Thanks.
You know,
yeah.
Is that something on your radar?
I'm always open to anything. And because I've been in the industry since 2016, I've seen my mentors and my peers go through acquisitions for screenplays.
Being optioned.
Yeah, option. Yes, that's the word. Thank you. Mohammed, whose latest book is The Other Half of You, was optioned for a television show, and he's been working on it closely with Courtney Collins, which I think is really amazing. And then in this very room that we're sitting in not too long ago, there was Benjamin Law, Michelle Law, Shirley Lee, and they were with Flying Bark Productions to talk about her own television show for Funny Ethnics and planning that out, because that's been optioned as well. And yeah, of course I'm open to anything that Dirt Poor Islanders generates. And I think a television show about Meta Reid's story, or kind of any Pacifica Australian story in general, I think would be really profound and important in this country, because it can show that we've moved way past Chris Lilly and Summer Heights High and Jonah from Tonga. And we're now together as a nation in a place where we're wanting to hear authentic stories by people from that community, which is really exciting.
It is. I can see it in your future.
Whoa, I hope you're like a fortune teller.
I pretend to be. To finish, is there something in your big life that's not necessarily about writing, but it could be another passion or hobby or habit that's helped you think differently about writing?
When I was starting off at Sweatshop, reading was my hobby. And then because it quickly became my job, Mohammed pointed out to me that I actually didn't have any hobbies anymore. So what do you do aside of...
Truth teller.
I know, it really just hits at home. You know, I grow from it, so it's always good. So then I spent a long time trying to find out what actually interested me. Cooking, for one, I find really nourishing and therapeutic, because I still feel like it's a hobby. I still feel like I'm learning something. Sometimes I'll be chopping an onion and then a sentence will pop into my head. I find it in those small little breaks of doing something very mechanical that I'm able to reflect on my own work and my own writing. Same with cross-stitching. I picked that up recently. And so when I'm threading a pattern together, I'm, again, thinking about how sentences are structured, and I'm thinking about a scene in a book that I really liked, or stitching and listening to music. And then currently I just really love listening to YouTube videos as like podcasts, like just commentaries about silly things like video games or iceberg charts or pyramid schemes, or the kind of natural storytelling structure that comes through those videos I find really comforting. And it also helps me think, oh, what would happen if I started referencing how Pacific Islander communities get sucked into pyramid schemes in my next book? So I find all those little mechanical things still influence my writing and still influence how I think about the craft of writing. And I love that. But I think I'm also ready to go back to study as well, like an editing course at a university or a librarian certificate at TAFE. Something practical like that, I think, is always good to have under your belt. The joy of being a writer is that you never want to stop learning. Yeah.
Winnie, I have learnt so much today.
I hope so. I feel like I rambled so much.
You ramble in a very eloquent way.
Oh, thank you.
Very much on track. I just, feel really grateful that you have the space and time to share so deeply and reflectively when there's so much going on for you.
No, thank you so much for those really lovely questions and letting me ramble and letting me be really open and honest.
Are You Still Working is an independently produced podcast by me, Courtney Collins, and producer Lisa Madden. If there's an artist you'd like us to interview, do let us know through Instagram at Are You Still Working Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if any episodes have inspired your own project. Till next time.